Hello, and welcome to the next episode in my Intro to Blender series. In this episode, we're going to be looking at edit mode and how to begin to model. So strap in and let's get started. Okay, so where we left off last class is we looked at how to add new objects and delete objects, as well as how do you duplicate objects. I'm going to turn on screencast keys before we do anything else. And I'll bump up the size. Right. Okay. So with screencasts are enabled, now you can follow along all the movements I do and like all the keys I press over here. Okay. So looking at edit mode and really explaining how we're going to begin the process of modeling within Blender, let's go over some basic details on first how we're going to select multiple objects. Okay, so to begin, to select an object, by default it is left click, and to now select multiple objects, what we'd have to do is hold down shift and click using our left mouse button. That allows us to select multiple objects at once. Now, how do we, if we wanted to, let's say, deselect, we could click outside of all of these objects and that would deselect. But if I very quickly wanted to, let's say, select everything, what I would press is A on the keyboard, and that would select all the objects in my scene. And then Alt-A would deselect all the objects in my scene. Alternatively, if you use A to select everything in your scene, and then you double tap A very quickly, that also deselects everything in your scene. Okay, so that's some basic selection tools. Again, that's just shift click and A and Alt A to select and deselect the objects in your scene. So why was that necessary? Well, when we enter edit mode, we're going to be dealing with multiple objects, so it's just an important skill to have and to know how to select objects. Okay, so how do we enter edit mode? Well, there are technically two ways to do this. First off, you can go over to the top left, come over to this drop-down menu here, and select edit mode, and that brings you automatically into edit mode. The other way you can enter edit mode is by hitting tab on your keyboard, and that basically toggles between object mode and edit mode. But I want to stay in edit mode for now. So once we enter edit mode, you're going to see some very subtle differences. So first off, let's try selecting one of these new points that showed up on the cube. So this point, this single point, is called a vertex. And this vertex is kind of like a point in space. If you've taken geometry, you know that if you connect 2 points, let's say these two, then that forms a line segment, or as Blender calls it, an edge. So to recap, vertex and 2 vertexes, if you combine them, 2 vertices I mean, that creates an edge, which should be highlighted with orange. Okay, and now if we select the surface that these 4 vertices are connected to, let's do that very quickly with shift click. That selects this entire surface, and this surface is what Blender calls a face. Right, so just to recap, we have a vertex, edge, and then face. Okay, so that is the basic terminology behind edit mode. Some other things I want to show you. If you go up to the top left again, you have these 3 little buttons here. And if we hover over it, it says Vertex Select. So Vertex Select basically means, as it is right now, we can select the individual vertices of the model. And what we can do with the vertices is that we can use the tools we learned in the first episode, like grabbing. If we select more than one vertex, we can rotate, and we can scale as well. I'll just hit Control Z to undo everything. So that is Vertex Select, but if we come over to Edge Select, now I can select just an edge and do the same things as grabbing, rotating, and scaling. And finally, if I go over to Face Select, I can select just a face and use the same tools of grabbing, rotating, and scaling. So these three tools are basically different ways of narrowing how you want to use the functions in Blender, whether or not you want to deal directly with vertices or if you want to deal with edges or faces. And the reason is when you get to more complicated meshes and objects, you're going to be dealing with a lot of vertices, and it might be really annoying to deal with so many vertices. And let's say you want to select a bunch of faces, it might be annoying clicking all those vertices to get what you want. So instead, you can go over to Face Select and just shift click a bunch of faces, and you've done it much faster and much more efficiently. Okay, so that is how you would select in edit mode. Now I'm going to show you some basic tools that you can use within edit mode. So of course the basic grab, rotate, and scale works within edit mode, but some other things you can do in edit mode are extruding, and this is very interesting. So we talked about before how you could do Shift D to duplicate objects, but what we didn't talk about is, let's say now in edit mode, if we have a face, what if I wanted to extend this face out? And if I wanted to add more vertices to follow, right? And I'll show you what that means. So if I hit E to extrude, what happens is a new face extrudes or branches out from the original face. And right now it's locked on an axis called normal axis. So let me just click to confirm, and I'll quickly explain what the normal axis is. Let's see if we took the cube from the side. A normal axis is basically an axis that is perpendicular, so 90 degrees from any point at the surface. So if the surface is moving down, let me just show you with my grease pencil. If the surface is moving down like so, if I were to draw a 90-degree line going this way, so it would be perpendicular to the surface, that would be your normal axis. And that is the direction where Blender will extrude the face from. Okay, let me just erase this very quickly. Okay. So that is how extruding, some of the functions behind extruding. And extruding is a very powerful tool because what you can do with it, if I hit E to extrude again, you can see that it automatically places you in kind of a move setting. So I can also hit Y or X or Z and use the same functions to move this extruded face, but I can also scale it. Let's say I scale it just inwards, and I'll do maybe let's do 0.5. If I scale it in, and now if I extrude down, very quickly, now I've created a very simple indent in this shape, in this object. And I can continue adding more detail, again using the same process of scaling in and extruding out. And very quickly, I can create kind of a small button within the object. So extruding is a very powerful tool for modeling, especially if you're doing inorganic modeling. It's very useful. and it can be used to add details, or even for a regular mesh, just extruding out new topology and new mesh data, so you have more vertices and more faces and edges to work with. Okay, so the next tool I want to show is how do you add, here's another way, I guess, if I have to say, another way of adding topology to your object. So if I were to hit Control R, it brings up something called a loop cut. Now what this does is it basically cuts into the mesh, and it creates a loop of edges around whatever area or whatever is highlighted in yellow. So it creates a cut. So this is something called the visualization stage, where Blender has not actually made the cut, but it's just showing you where a potential cut could be. So before I click anything, what's neat is not only can I move around my cursor and see where I can make cuts, but I can also hit plus or minus, or if you have a scroll wheel, you can also use your scroll wheel, and you can basically determine how many cuts you want to make. So I could theoretically make 2 or, I don't know, 10 cuts if I really wanted to. For now, I'm going to make 2 cuts and click. And now the second part, or the second stage in loop cuts, is now you have the edge slide mode. So now Blender has made the cuts, but now you can slide the edges along the loops, or you can slide the loops along where the faces they were cut, if that makes any sense. So you're basically sliding. And let's say I wanted to put my loops dead in the center, just like they were in the visualization. All I would have to do is hit the right mouse button, and that places it right in the center. Now, if I did the entire process again, and then now if I slid it, what you're going to notice is that if I go over here, it says edge slide 1. And if I go to the other direction, it says edge slide -1, and the middle would be 0. So if you were in other stages of modeling, what you could do is you could use those precise numbers. Let's say I wanted to do 0.5. So this would be roughly, 1/4 of the distance from this initial vertice to this one. And I could click to confirm, and that will create a very precise cut. So that's another way you can add topology to the meshes that you are modeling and working on. Okay, so those are the modeling techniques that we're going to be learning for this tutorial. What I want to leave you with is something about modeling etiquette, let's say. Okay, so something interesting that you can do within edit mode is, of course, you can do Shift A, and unlike in object mode, you still have the regular primitives, but when you add them, they will instead add, directly in edit mode. And if you go back into object mode, they're now a part of this initial object. So think of the object as kind of, if you ever played with Lego blocks, or built using any type of like block or brick system. So when you build something like a house, let's say the object is the whole house. Well, all the data, so all the vertices, edges, and faces, are kind of like the individual bricks that make up the house, if that makes any sense. The object is kind of like the container, and the vertices, technically you can have more than one mesh within an object. So that's how you can add other primitives in your object already. But what I wanted to show you is some standard modeling etiquette. So I'm going to take this plane, and I'm going to quickly I'll go over what I'm doing in the next tutorial, which is how to add faces and how to get into other parts of modeling. But I just want to show you for now the difference between polygons and triangles. And this is a very important distinction. And what it basically is that for polygons, these are, 4 vertices and 4 edges, and they create, a single face. What you can do in Blender as well is that you can have triangles where you connect 3 vertices and 3 edges and make a face. Now, if you have any understanding of the game industry, or if you've ever dealt with models from video games, you know that most game assets are done with triangles, mainly because it's much easier for their game engines to render. But the difference is that in Blender is more suited to using polygons instead. So that's 4 vertices and 4 edges. It's a very versatile format to use triangles, mainly because, every polygon is technically just 2 triangles put together. But since Blender is an animation software, it's much easier if you just use 4 vertices and make polygons. So in most scenarios, you should stick to modeling with 4 vertices, 4 edges, and just use polygons. But in very rare cases where you need to add, an extra vertice, or you have one left and you don't want a hole, that is when you can use triangles. And that's just basic etiquette of modeling within Blender. So mainly stick to polygons and then use triangles in rare cases. Okay, so that is all for this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.